Just 2 weeks ago, Sean Combs' The Reckoning dropped on Netflix, and nothing has been the same since. What viewers expected to be another polished hip-hop retrospective
We're
instead
losing.
arrived like a silent detonation. 4 episodes, no flashy marketing, no promotional interviews. Just a sudden release from 50 Cent that felt calculated, restrained, and devastatingly intentional. People started watching casually, then they leaned forward because this documentary didn't narrate allegations. It revealed patterns. It didn't sensationalize trauma. It mapped timelines. It didn't shout. It whispered. And whispers are harder to ignore. The opening scenes were unsettling in their simplicity. Quiet footage in hotel hallways. Camera angles viewers recognized from old tabloid stories, except now they were aligned with dates and timestamps. Clips played with no dramatic music, no text overlays, just raw video. Security cameras capturing moments that once slid under public memory. But now, in context, those lingering shots felt incriminating in ways words couldn't convey. Then came footage of private rooms, low-lit parties, isolated corridors. Nothing explicit, nothing illegal shown outright. But the framing, the pacing, the unbroken silence suggested missing pieces viewers could now sense but not yet see. And behind every frame, audiences felt a presence. 50 Cent, not on camera, not narrating, but orchestrating the narrative flow with unsettling precision. It was as if he knew exactly when to let silence speak, when to pause, when to let viewers sit uncomfortably with what they were seeing. He didn't need to accuse anyone. He just placed evidence where denial became difficult. Before going deeper into this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon, okay? That's how you'll never miss breaking developments like this. Within days of release, viewers across social platforms began breaking down scenes frame by frame. Lawyers analyzed footage. Journalists reopened archived reports. Former associates refused to comment on record. It was clear this documentary wasn't trending because of hype. It was trending because of implications. In this fictional alternate timeline, federal authorities monitoring the documentary's circulation flagged segments of leaked footage. The alignment between timestamps and previously sealed testimony raised immediate concern. Questions were whispered in courthouse hallways. If this footage is authentic, how did it remain hidden? What else might exist? And more importantly, does it impact sentencing? Behind sealed doors, judges requested private reviews of the footage. Analysts synchronized video files with case logs. What began as a documentary suddenly pressed against the edges of legal procedure. Weekend schedules shifted. Emergency consultations booked. Something that had been dormant inside the legal system began to stir. Because when visual evidence surfaces, even through a documentary, the courtroom can no longer ignore what millions have seen. The deeper viewers went into Sean Combs, The Reckoning, the more uneasy they became. Episode 2 didn't sensationalize anything. It simply revealed footage in a sequence that felt impossible to dismiss. Dates flashed across the lower corner of screens. Timestamps aligned from security logs pulled years apart. Each clip seemed ordinary until paired with silent shadows moving in hallways, closed doors guarded by staff, and brief glances exchanged between people who looked more like sentinels than guests. In one scene, cameras caught a young assistant guiding a woman down a corridor, whispering something just outside the range of the mic. The footage froze briefly, zoomed on the door handle, the timestamp matching a night referenced in a long-buried deposition. The episode never narrated accusations. It simply placed the footage. Let the viewers breathe through the silence. The audience did the rest. People began tracking movements like investigators. Who entered rooms, who left, what time gaps existed between appearances. Online threads reconstructed floor plans of hotels from the footage. Articles compared old lawsuits to screenshot timelines from the documentary. The internet became a hive of analysis. Patterns began to emerge, not through sensational editing, but through proximity. In this alternate timeline, federal monitors reviewing online chatter flagged a surge in conversations mentioning sealed filings and court transcripts from years past. The similarity between documentary sequences and long-forgotten witness statements raised questions behind closed doors. Clerks began retrieving archived digital evidence that hadn't been accessed in years. Hard drives spun awake across federal servers. Meanwhile, inside law offices representing Combs, urgency grew. Senior attorneys called emergency meetings requesting full internal reviews of every NDA, every settlement, every piece of footage not previously disclosed. Assistants whispered concerns, asking whether the leaked edition online contained materials never submitted to court. Partners avoided eye contact, knowing what that would imply. The documentary's pacing was methodical, slow, heavy. Episode 3 lingered on still photographs, candid shots, after-party snapshots, blurred faces and backgrounds. At first glance, nothing incriminating. But when the narrator revealed the exact dates those photos were taken and the cities they were taken in, viewers realized the chilling implication. Those locations matched Knight's plaintiffs referenced in long-dismissed allegations. Suddenly, online researchers began cross-referencing public timelines of Combs' travel, performance schedules, and business meetings. Users posted digital maps plotting movement patterns across states. Overlays of photos and itineraries spread through platforms like wildfire. In the fictional version of events unfolding here, federal offices could no longer ignore the mounting alignment between visuals and testimony. Analysts uploaded digital clips from the documentary into evidence review software, matching timestamps to travel manifests and hotel security records. Not all matches were perfect, but enough correlations emerged to raise concern. Judges reviewing sealed summaries sensed the weight behind the coincidences. And it wasn't the footage alone. It was the consistency, the narrative threading together across years. Behind courtroom walls, prosecutors whispered discussions about whether the new material demanded reconsideration. Defense counsel feared what else might surface and whether clients could face exposure beyond public scandal. The reckoning had done something no prior allegation ever achieved. It connected timelines the world had never seen aligned, and systems built to ignore whispers began shifting, slowly, toward forced attention. Episode 4 changed everything. It opened with no music, no narration, just a dimly lit room captured from a low corner angle, like a camera installed without permission. The door opened and closed several times. People entered quietly, some glancing toward the lens as if unsure whether they sensed being watched. The camera timestamp matched a date referenced in sealed testimony years earlier. Viewers online slowed the scene to half speed. They zoomed. They enhanced audio, catching fragments of whispered names, transaction-like exchanges, and subtle gestures signaling authority, fear, and familiarity. The clip lasted less than 2 minutes, but it triggered thousands of new threads connecting dots across decades. In this imagined timeline, the clip's exposure spread through encrypted chat groups before mainstream platforms reacted. Investigators monitoring public sentiment flagged sudden surges in discussions referencing evidence chain breaks, discovery violations, and suppressed footage claims. The possibility that the original trial lacked full disclosure began circulating among legal analysts. Suddenly, the question central to the documentary shifted. Not what happened, but what was hidden. That shift reached federal ears faster than expected. Inside the courthouse, whispered conversations grew sharper. Prosecutors quietly re-examined old digital logs, searching for records of the footage. if the documentary contained evidence never submitted during discovery, the legal implications could be catastrophic. Judges demand integrity of evidence procedure, and violations can reopen cases, trigger sanctions, and, in rare circumstances, escalate sentencing. Meanwhile, in corporate conference rooms across Los Angeles and New York, executives who once brushed off rumors now feared exposure. One label executive stared at the leaked footage on his office screen, expression tightening with each second. He had been at that room years earlier, standing just outside the frame. Memory and denial collided inside him. In the entertainment world, silence spread, not as strategy, but as instinct. Lawyers advised clients to freeze communication. Phones buzzed with messages, reading only, "Don't respond. No comment. We need to talk." Then the documentary dropped a final sequence. A hallway, a closed door, a familiar silhouette entering with staff trailing behind. The timestamp matched another sealed affidavit passage, one dismissed for insufficient evidence. The camera lingered long enough for viewers to recognize the unsettling implication. Someone had documented these nights intentionally, methodically, over time. Legal scholars began speculating publicly. If the footage existed privately and aligned with sealed testimony, was the system unknowingly misled? Did the prosecution fail to obtain all evidence? Did defense conceal material? Each question carried consequences, not just for Combs, but for everyone with knowledge of suppressed footage. In this alternate unfolding, judges tasked internal audit teams with reviewing evidence logs connected to the original case. Unredacted inventories resurfaced. Missing entries drew immediate concern. A pattern emerged. Footage listed vaguely or referenced indirectly, but not included in final disclosure. The implications were staggering. Late-night strategy sessions took place behind sealed doors. Prosecutors debated whether the new alignment constituted grounds for emergency resentencing. Defense counsel prepared contingency arguments, fearing a scenario no one expected: the possibility of sentence escalation based on newly surfaced material. Meanwhile, across the country, viewers watched in darkness, replaying the final footage over and over, unaware of the legal machinery now awakening because of what they'd just seen. What started as a documentary binge had become something heavier, a chain reaction rippling from screens into courtrooms, rewriting assumptions about what justice looks like when exposure forces institutions to confront what they once ignored. In the weeks that followed the documentary's release, the ripple effects traveled far beyond social feeds and reaction videos. Something shifted beneath the surface, subtle at first, then unmistakable, like pressure building beneath a fault line. Inside federal offices, analysts quietly compared public footage to archived testimony. When timestamps aligned with travel logs and hotel rosters from sealed proceedings, eyebrows raised. One analyst paused mid-review, whispering to a colleague that the matches felt too precise to ignore. No accusations, just patterns quietly forming. A late-night conference call between prosecutors escalated into an emergency in-person session before sunrise. They met behind frosted glass walls, folders thick with cross-referenced screenshots, and logs printed hastily from servers that hadn't been accessed in years. Voices lowered when assistants walked by. The fear wasn't about what they already knew. It was about what they might be forced to uncover. Defense attorneys, alerted through unofficial channels, convened their own gathering. Phones placed in drawers, blinds shut. The lead counsel asked a question that made the room fall silent. Is it possible the footage shown publicly exists in full-length versions? And if so, who still has them? No one responded. The absence of certainty was louder than any admission. Publicly, nothing happened. No motions filed, no statements released. But behind walls, preparation began. Clerks reorganized evidence logs. Judges reviewed precedent regarding sentencing reconsideration triggered by new material. Internal memos circulated cautiously, hinting at the potential reopening of sealed segments of the record. In studios across Los Angeles, executives scanned contracts, NDAS, and archived communications. One former producer found a file on an old hard drive labeled simply Hotel C Uncut. He stared at the timestamp, realization washing over him as he remembered standing outside a locked door that night, hearing whispers he tried to forget. His hands shook as he debated deleting the file or calling a lawyer. Meanwhile, online conversation took a darker turn. Forums no longer asked whether the footage was real. They now wondered how much more existed. A post claiming to contain a list of still hidden material went viral, and although fact-checkers debunked it, the seed had been planted. The public imagination had crossed into fear. In this fictional alternate reality, the judge overseeing Combs' case requested access to sealed digital archives. The order was written carefully, acknowledging public concerns regarding undisclosed visual evidence. Within hours, drives were retrieved from storage and queued for audit. The fact that a judge ordered weekend review sent shockwaves through the legal chain. One clerk, reviewing an intake record from years prior, noticed an inconsistency. A set of video files referenced but never certified into evidence. The accompanying notes were vague, handwritten, and abruptly cut off mid-sentence. The clerk reread them repeatedly, realizing their implications. The trigger wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. A missing file, a mismatched timestamp, a notation referencing surveillance to be reviewed later. Those three elements, aligned with what millions saw in the documentary, changed everything. Inside a secure courtroom with closed blinds and muted phones, the judge reviewed a compilation of matched footage. He watched without commentary, his hand resting still beside the gavel.
We have to find somebody that'll work with us that has dealt in the dirtiest of dirty business. We're losing.
When the lights rose, the judge exhaled, long and slow, as though carrying the weight of something irreversible. He knew what the footage suggested, not necessarily guilt beyond conviction, but concealment beyond justification. And concealment, when proven, carries consequences no sentence can ignore. A silence settled over the room, deeper than the quiet before. It was the silence of recognition, the moment when everyone present understood that the path forward no longer led toward appeal. It led toward escalation. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the silence lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Staff walked the corridors with eyes lowered, as though acknowledging that something irreversible now lived in the air. Outside, the winter sun was rising, but inside the courthouse walls, the temperature felt colder than before. Behind a closed conference door, prosecutors gathered around a table covered with printed frames pulled from the documentary. Each sheet held a timestamp, a still image, and handwritten notes connecting details. Matching wristbands, same carpet patterns, identical exit signs, figures appearing in multiple locations across nights once thought unrelated. Someone pointed to the overlapping dates. Another connected witness.
We have to find somebody that'll work with us that has dealt in the dirtiest of dirty business. We're losing.
But because they feared the magnitude of what those overlapping threads implied. A phrase repeated in a whisper. How did this never surface? Across the building, defense counsel prepared arguments they had hoped never to use. They debated strategy, questioning whether the leaked footage could be authenticated, whether chain of custody could be challenged, or whether the court had authority to escalate sentencing so late. But beneath every legal argument hung a heavier question, whether denial could survive alignment this precise. Meanwhile, news footage played silently in the background. Headlines scrolling, anchors speculating, analysts warning of potential ramifications should new evidence prove credible. No one in the defense room looked directly at the screen. avoidance became shield. Court staff received instructions to prepare secure storage for incoming digital exhibits. One clerk paused mid-task, staring at a transfer order requesting immediate custody review for a high-profile inmate. The clerk had seen expedited requests before, but never one written with such urgency, marked priority reassessment pending. On social media, theories spiraled faster than fact checks could keep up. Some claimed eyewitness accounts. Others posted alleged leaks showing blurred thumbnails of footage believed to be part of the documentary's extended cut. Most posts vanished within minutes, flagged, removed, archived. But screenshots lived, shared across encrypted channels. The legal system moved slower, but with precision. Internal emails marked confidential suggested the judge would schedule a closed emergency hearing. Some government employees quietly called spouses to cancel holiday plans. Others cleared calendars without explanation. When bureaucracy shifts overnight, the reason rarely stays small. In his holding cell, Diddy sat alone, elbows on knees, staring at concrete flooring. For the first time since sentencing, his expression wavered. No longer calculated defiance, but confusion edged with dread. Guards exchanged a glance they wouldn't admit. The realization that power, once absolute, now seemed fragile in this alternate chain of events. As hours passed, the courthouse filled again, not with the usual weekend silence, but with hurried footsteps, rushed whispers, rustling paper. The very infrastructure meant to remain predictable now moved with urgency. Judges rarely summon emergency proceedings, rarer still for sentencing reconsideration. The prosecutor leading the case walked down the hallway gripping a folder tightly, knuckles white. Inside were printed stills from the documentary's timestamp-aligned footage, alongside travel logs acquired years earlier but now bearing new meaning. Each page represented not speculation, but synthesis, the merging of fragments into a narrative impossible to unsee. The closer the team moved toward the hearing, the more palpable the tension became. It wasn't fear of losing, it was fear of uncovering truth too heavy to hold. And everyone sensed that when the judge entered the chamber again, the trajectory of the case would shift from correction to consequence, from closure to escalation. The emergency hearing began without cameras, without spectators, without the performative confidence courtroom battles often display. Chairs shifted softly against the floor as attorneys took their places. The judge entered not with ceremony, but with a quiet gravity that made everyone straighten in their seats. Papers rustled, a clock ticked loud against the heavy air. The prosecutor stood, voice steady, though hands trembled almost imperceptibly. He presented the timeline, first the footage leaked publicly, then the synchronized timestamps, then the new alignment with sealed testimony. His tone wasn't dramatic, it was clinical. That's what made it more unsettling. Screens illuminated the darkened courtroom once more. Pixelated shadows moved through hallways, figures entering rooms at precise times. The judge watched without blinking. Defense attorneys scribbled notes furiously, whispering objections they knew wouldn't change what everyone saw. Diddy sat motionless, jaw tight, as the footage replayed angles the public had slowed down thousands of times already. The prosecutor then submitted additional documents retrieved overnight, records showing flight itineraries, hotel check-ins, guest lists, call logs. Each document appeared benign until placed in sequence against the footage. Suddenly, the gaps that once seemed harmless looked engineered. Patterns formed where randomness should have existed. Defense rose next. Their argument leaned heavily on chain of custody questions, on authentication issues, on the impropriety of using publicly leaked material in resentencing. Yet even they spoke with caution, avoiding statements that could later be interpreted as knowing complicity. The judge listened, head bowed slightly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For several minutes, no one spoke. The courtroom sat suspended in a stillness thick with anticipation and dread. When the judge finally lifted his gaze, something in his eyes had changed. He requested a brief recess to review a sealed preliminary summary prepared by forensic analysts. Spectators weren't allowed, but whispers spread among the staff who handled the paperwork. Some exchanged glances, recognizing names referenced inside, names that hadn't surfaced publicly. During the recess, guards escorted Diddy to a holding room adjacent to the chamber. He asked to speak with counsel privately. The request was granted. Moments later, muffled but raised voices leaked through the thick door. One guard shifted uncomfortably, averting his eyes as though hearing something he wished he hadn't. Back in the chamber, prosecutors reviewed final notes. One pointed silently to an email thread highlighted with urgency markers. Another nodded grimly, understanding the implication. A subordinate lawyer whispered, "If this holds, escalation isn't optional anymore." Defense returned pale, shaken. Whatever had been discussed behind closed doors had shifted their strategy. Their objections softened, voices lowered, shoulders slumped just slightly. The judge re-entered. He didn't clear his throat, didn't shuffle papers. He simply spoke, voice steady, deliberate. The opening line sent a chill across every person in the room. There is sufficient cause to consider the possibility of suppression and misrepresentation. The words landed like a blow. Prosecutors straightened. Defense froze. Diddy's eyes widened. Mason, not defiance, but the first flash of panic. The judge ordered an immediate evidentiary review. Not next week, not after recess, now, on a Saturday, with full authority. What followed was unprecedented. Sealed files reopened, evidence logged for reassessment, and the original sentence suspended pending review. Court officers moved swiftly, aware they were participating in a moment that would echo well beyond these walls. Somewhere deep in the courthouse, printers hummed, servers were awake, case files transferred from archive to active. Legal history doesn't shift quietly, but this shift was silent, controlled, and terrifying in its precision. And as the courtroom prepared for the next phase, one truth settled heavy in the air. Whatever came next would not resemble mercy. The system, once delayed, had begun to move. And momentum like this doesn't stop. The evidentiary review continued late into the afternoon, long past the hour when courtrooms should have been empty. No phones rang, no footsteps echoed in the hall. Everyone inside moved with a quiet understanding that history was unfolding one file, one frame, one timestamp at a time. Screens flickered with paused images pulled directly from the documentary. The same fragments millions had seen online, except here they were paired with documents the public never knew existed. Travel schedules aligned with hotel surveillance metadata, text exchanges referenced rooms visible in CCTV stills, statements once dismissed for lack of corroboration suddenly found visual echoes. Defense attorneys whispered anxiously, their earlier confidence drained. One tapped his pen repeatedly, eyes fixed on the screen. Another rubbed his forehead and whispered, "How did this get out?" The question wasn't rhetorical, it was fear disguised as confusion. Diddy watched silently. His breathing changed rhythm with each new image. He didn't look at the prosecutors or the judge. He stared only at the footage, at shadows and walls he recognized, at timelines he once believed buried beneath settlement language and NDAS. The judge asked a single question. Is there credible evidence suggesting these recordings were withheld during initial discovery? The prosecutor nodded slowly. "We believe there is significant probability," he answered. Silence followed, heavy, suffocating. Because withholding evidence isn't scandal, it's crime. It transforms cases. It escalates charges. It reopens sentences. A clerk entered quietly, holding a sealed envelope. She avoided looking at anyone as she handed it to the judge. He broke the seal and scanned the contents. His expression hardened, not shocked, but resigned, as though confirming something he hoped wasn't true. The prosecutor requested permission to introduce the contents immediately.
We have to find somebody that'll work with us that has dealt in the dirtiest of dirty business. We're losing.
But their voices lacked conviction. They sensed inevitability creeping toward them. The judge approved. The envelope contained internal communication logs referencing restricted surveillance archives and unsubmitted digital recordings tied to locations shown in the documentary. Notes suggested the existence of a separate evidence repository, one never disclosed during trial. Defense froze. Prosecutors leaned closer, stunned not by the allegations, but by the trail of documentation verifying them. In a hushed voice, the judge delivered a warning neither side expected. If suppression is confirmed, sentencing may require reassessment consistent with statutory guidelines. No one missed the meaning behind those words. Statutory guidelines included escalation for concealed evidence linked to violent or coercive offenses. Diddy inhaled sharply, shoulders stiffening. The room sensed his panic, even though his expression remained controlled. For the first time, the hearing felt less like review and more like reckoning, slow, methodical, and irreversible. Defense attorneys exchanged frantic glances. One leaned toward Diddy and whispered urgently. He shook his head slightly, jaw tensed. It was unclear whether he refused strategy or simply realized strategy no longer mattered. Outside the courthouse, nothing suggested the world-changing moment unfolding within the sealed walls. Traffic hummed, pedestrians walked past without pause. No breaking news alerts lit up screens, yet. Inside, the judge called for brief adjournment to finalize preliminary decisions. Attorneys gathered their notes shakily. Court officers escorted Diddy out through the side door, avoiding the main corridor. As the heavy door closed behind him, the echo carried a meaning no words could express. It was the sound of control slipping, of influence dissolving, of a legal tidal wave gathering force just beyond the courtroom floor. And as everyone waited for the judge to return, they understood. The next ruling would not simply reconsider sentencing. It would determine whether Sean Combs walked back into the world or whether he remained behind bars permanently in this alternate unfolding timeline. The judge returned with a stillness that made every person in the chamber straighten instinctively. No shuffled papers, no measured throat clear, just a quiet breath before the words that would divide the timeline, before and after. He sat, glanced toward the sealed evidence, then lifted his eyes to the room. The pause stretched long enough for the fluorescent lights to hum audibly overhead. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of finality. The court acknowledges credible indication that significant recorded material relevant to the original sentencing was withheld from discovery. Defense counsel inhaled sharply. One attorney's pen slipped from his fingers. Diddy blinked slowly, as though the words entered his body like cold water. The judge continued. This development materially alters the court's original assessment of sentencing proportionality. There it was, the shift from review to consequence. A tremor passed through the room, not movement, but energy, a collective recognition that justice, delayed for years, had finally found leverage. Prosecutors requested immediate authority to present the newly reviewed evidence in full. Defense attempted to object, citing procedural safeguards, but their voices faltered. The judge raised a hand gently and silence returned. This court will not ignore omissions of this magnitude, he said, voice firm. The sentence previously imposed is vacated. Vacated. The word struck like a hammer. For a moment, no one moved. Even the air felt suspended. The judge leaned forward, eyes fixed on the defense table. In light of the severity implied by the submitted recordings, the documented concealment, and the emergent alignment with sealed testimony, Sean Combs is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without eligibility for early release. The room didn't erupt in chaos, it froze. The silence was louder than any outburst could have been. The guards standing near the door straightened, subtly repositioning themselves. Defense attorneys sat paralyzed. No motions filed, no objections mustered, not because they accepted the sentence, but because the ground beneath their legal footing had vanished. Diddy's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, as though the weight he'd spent decades outrunning had finally settled across his back. His eyes darted briefly toward the sealed screens still displaying paused footage. He recognized every hallway, every doorway, every timestamp. This was the moment the alternate timeline bent permanently into consequence. Not because of a documentary, not because of public outrage, but because the footage aligned too precisely, too repeatedly with testimony that had once stood alone. Patterns became proof. Silence became evidence. Court officers approached cautiously. Handcuffs clicked shut, not as routine, but as punctuation. A lifetime of influence dissolved into a chain-link restraint symbolizing the collapse of control. The judge closed his folder slowly, signaling the end of the hearing. No speeches, no explanations, just a final statement. This court stands adjourned. The gavel fell softly, but the sound reverberated like thunder through the sealed chamber. It was the definitive moment when speculation transformed into consequence, when patterns became law, and when a documentary's shadow crossed into a courtroom and rewrote a man's fate forever in this imagined unfolding. Outside, the world continued unaware, for now, but inside, history had shifted. There was no returning to the sentence before, no undoing the exposure that triggered the legal unraveling, no escaping the reckoning that now defines Sean Combs' future.
I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I kind of like Diddy.
My favorite hero.
I have a lot of guys that I look up to their accomplishments, but I wouldn't call them my heroes.
Right. You don't wear another man's jersey on your back.
Yeah.
Respect. Your favorite villain?
My favorite villain?
But shaping the rhythm of the story, choosing when to let silence sit, when to slow down, when to let a single clip play just long enough for discomfort to settle in. He wasn't presenting verdicts. He was presenting patterns. And patterns are harder to dismiss. As clips circulated online, people didn't react with instant outrage. They reacted with focus. Scenes were replayed frame by frame. Old interviews resurfaced. Lines that once sounded harmless now felt unfinished. The conversation shifted from "Is this real?" to "How did we miss this?" Before we go deeper, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story doesn't unfold loudly, it unfolds slowly, and the details matter. What followed wasn't chaos, it was quiet tension. Industry figures avoided commenting, lawyers declined interviews, familiar faces stayed silent. And in moments like this, silence doesn't calm things down, it sharpens them. Because when everyone knows a conversation has started, pretending it isn't happening only draws more attention to it. The documentary didn't frame itself as an attack. It framed itself as memory, as history revisited with a clearer lens. It suggested, without declaring, that power doesn't always move openly. Sometimes it moves through access, through decisions made behind closed doors, through who gets platforms and who quietly doesn't. By the end of this opening stretch, one thing was clear. This wasn't about one clip or one name. It was about control, about how narratives are shaped, about how certain questions stay unasked for years, until the right moment forces them into the open. And once those questions are out there, they don't go away. They wait, they grow, and they change how everything that follows is seen. As the documentary settled into public consciousness, attention began shifting toward the voice that refused to soften its tone, not because it was louder than everyone else, but because it wasn't. While others measured their words, 50 Cent leaned into something far more uncomfortable: consistency. He didn't suddenly appear with a new narrative. He returned with the same questions he had been asking for years, questions that once sounded like provocation, but now felt like warning. What separates him from most industry figures isn't volume, it's position. According to his own statements over the years, he has never depended on quiet approval or polished alliances to survive. He built his career confronting systems head-on, even when it cost him access. And in a culture where access is everything, that makes him dangerous in a very specific way. The documentary doesn't present him as a hero. It presents him as a contrast. While some figures cultivated distance, refinement, and silence, 50 Cent leaned into friction. He challenged decisions publicly. He mocked power instead of negotiating with it. And when the industry moved on, he stayed exactly where he was, watching. That history matters, because when he revisits old rivalries now, they don't sound like unresolved beef. They sound like unresolved structure. What once looked like personality clashes begin to resemble philosophical ones. Loud disruption versus quiet control. Transparency versus management. Presence versus polish. The documentary carefully revisits moments where paths crossed but never merged. Platforms built side by side. Opportunities opened for some and closed for others. Careers that surged while others stalled without explanation. No accusations are made. No conclusions are drawn. The audience is simply shown the sequence and invited to sit with the discomfort of alignment. This is where Jay-Z enters the conversation, not as a villain, not as a target, but as a symbol of a different kind of power. Controlled, strategic, immaculately presented. Where 50 Cent challenges systems from the outside, Jay-Z is often described as someone who learned how to operate inside them, and that contrast fuels everything that follows. According to 50 Cent's public commentary, power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it refines itself. Sometimes it builds credibility so slowly and carefully that it becomes untouchable. And when power reaches that stage, it doesn't need to respond to criticism. It lets silence do the work. The documentary doesn't say one approach is right and the other is wrong. It asks something far more unsettling. Which one shapes outcomes more effectively? The one who disrupts openly, or the one who moves quietly while everyone else argues? As viewers absorb this contrast, something subtle happens. The story stops feeling like it's about individuals. It starts feeling like it's about design, about how systems reward certain behaviors and punish others without ever making those rules explicit. By the time this chapter closes, the audience understands one crucial thing. This isn't a clash of personalities. It's a clash of methods. And when methods collide, The fallout doesn't look like conflict. It looks like silence, delayed reactions, and power that never has to explain itself. That realization lingers, because once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. As the conversation deepened, the focus shifted away from personalities and towards something far less visible, but far more powerful. The mechanics behind success, the moves that never make headlines, the decisions that shape careers without ever being announced. The documentary begins laying these moments side by side. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just sequentially. One artist rises fast, another stalls just as momentum builds. A platform launches with promises of equity and collaboration, then quietly consolidates under one direction. No single moment feels explosive on its own, but together they form a pattern that's difficult to unsee. According to 50 Cent's long-standing commentary, the industry doesn't need to block you publicly to stop you. It just needs to redirect attention, delay a release, change a playlist placement, close a door without ever admitting it existed. Power, in this version of events, works best when it looks like coincidence. The documentary revisits familiar names, not to accuse but to contextualize. Artists who once seemed unstoppable. Deals that sounded fair on paper. Opportunities that arrived with conditions no one talked about openly. Viewers are reminded that success in this world isn't only about talent. It's about who controls the lanes. What makes this section unsettling is how normal it all feels. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, just leverage. Relationships. Influence layered over time. The kind of influence that doesn't need force, because it's already built into the system. 50 Cent has often described this as a quiet hierarchy. One where being difficult, even when you're right, comes with consequences. Where refusing to align doesn't get you punished publicly, but it does get you remembered differently. According to him, the industry never forgets who doesn't play along. The documentary doesn't ask viewers to pick sides. It asks them to reconsider how many careers they assumed faded naturally, how many opportunities they believed were missed due to timing or luck, and how many of those explanations were simply easier than confronting the idea of control. As scenes unfold, the story moves beyond individual disputes and into something broader. Culture itself. Who decides what sound dominates? Which narratives get celebrated? Which ones quietly disappear? And how influence at the top filters down into everything the audience eventually sees and hears. There's a moment where the film lingers, not on footage, but on absence. Names that should be here but aren't. Voices that once mattered, now reduced to footnotes. The silence feels intentional. Because sometimes what's missing says more than what's shown. By the end of this stretch, the audience realizes the stakes are higher than any feud. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about understanding a system that rarely reveals its rules. A system where power doesn't always crush. It redirects, reshapes, and waits. And once you start seeing that pattern, it becomes impossible to believe everything unfolded by chance. As the picture widened, the documentary slowed down again, almost deliberately, forcing attention onto something most people prefer not to examine. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of restraint. The kind that spreads through an industry quietly, teaching people what not to say without ever spelling it out. The film suggests that silence isn't accidental. It's learned. It's passed down. New artists don't arrive knowing the rules, but they learn them quickly by watching what happens to those who speak too freely. Careers don't always end with explosions. Sometimes they simply fade. Calls stop coming. Invitations disappear. Momentum dissolves without explanation. According to commentary surrounding the documentary, this is how survival works at the highest levels. You don't challenge power directly. You don't ask questions publicly. You protect access at all costs. Because access isn't just opportunity, it's safety. And losing it can feel worse than failure. The documentary revisits moments when people almost spoke, interviews where answers stopped short, statements that felt rehearsed, body language that suggested more was being held back than shared. None of it framed as guilt, none of it framed as innocence, just hesitation, repetition, patterns of restraint. What makes this uncomfortable is how familiar it feels. Viewers recognize it from other industries, other moments, other scandals. The same pause before a sentence, the same careful wording, the same insistence on moving forward without ever looking back. The story hints that silence often disguises itself as professionalism, as maturity, as knowing better than to get involved. But beneath that surface, silence becomes a currency. Those who spend it wisely remain inside the circle. Those who don't, drift out. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of enforcing this. It doesn't need to. It shows how the system enforces itself. People watch what happens to others and adjust accordingly. No threats required, no warnings issued, just observation. At this point, the narrative begins to feel heavier. Not because new information is revealed, but because the implications sink in. If silence is this effective, how many stories were never told? How many moments were explained away because speaking felt riskier than forgetting? The film lingers on this idea, letting it breathe. It allows the audience to sit with the possibility that what they've seen over the years, successes, failures, disappearances, may not have been random. They may have been guided by invisible boundaries no one publicly acknowledges. As this realization settles, the tone shifts subtly. The conversation is no longer about individual choices. It's about atmosphere, about an environment where silence becomes instinctive and instinct becomes policy. And once silence reaches that level, it stops being neutral. It starts shaping outcomes. As the documentary moves forward, the focus shifts to something far more subtle and far more unsettling than any direct claim. Proximity, not guilt, not innocence, just closeness. The kind that naturally raises questions without ever forming accusations. The film doesn't point fingers. It places people in rooms, on stages, at events, overlapping timelines, shared platforms, familiar faces appearing again and again in the same spaces over long stretches of time. The viewer isn't told what to conclude. They're asked to notice what repetition looks like when it stops feeling accidental. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because proximity doesn't prove anything, but it does challenge the idea of ignorance. When people move within the same circles for years, attend the same gatherings, collaborate on the same ventures, the question isn't who did what. It becomes who knew what and when. According to commentary surrounding the documentary, this is the question power hates most. Not because it demands an answer, but because it can't be dismissed easily. You can deny actions. You can dispute timelines, but you can't erase shared presence. The film revisits moments where alliances were publicly celebrated. Smiles, applause, joint appearances framed as unity. At the time, these moments symbolized success. Now, viewed through a different lens, they feel heavier, not sinister, just unresolved. What's striking is how carefully the documentary avoids conclusions. It never says, "This means that." It simply allows the audience to feel the tension of unanswered questions. And that restraint is intentional, because when a film doesn't tell you what to think, you end up thinking longer. As this section unfolds, viewers begin to recognize a pattern in how influence operates. Relationships don't just create opportunity, they create insulation. Being close to power can protect you from scrutiny, or place you at the center of it when narratives shift. The documentary suggests that proximity can be both shield and spotlight. It elevates some while complicating others. And when conversations finally surface, those connections become impossible to ignore. What makes this moment linger is the absence of response. No one rushes to clarify. No one fills the silence. Statements remain carefully worded if they appear at all, and that quiet stretches, leaving space for interpretation. At this point, the audience realizes the film isn't trying to expose secrets. It's exposing discomfort. The kind that comes from realizing some questions don't need answers to be powerful. Because once proximity is visible, denial stops being convincing. And even without accusations, the conversation has already changed. As the story continues, the lens turns towards something the industry understands better than anyone else: image. Not reputation, but design. The careful construction of how someone is seen, remembered, and ultimately trusted. The documentary doesn't rush this moment. It slows down, almost inviting the viewer to reflect on how perception is built over time. How someone can evolve from raw beginnings into a symbol of refinement. How language changes. How posture changes. How silence becomes elegance instead of avoidance. This is where branding stops being marketing and starts becoming armor. The film revisits the transformation that audiences applauded for years. The shift from street credibility to boardroom authority. From unpredictable to dependable. From controversial to curated. Every step celebrated as growth. Every change framed as maturity. And in many ways, it was. But the documentary asks a quieter question beneath the applause. What does that transformation protect? According to long-standing commentary echoed throughout the film, respectability changes how scrutiny works. People ask different questions. They assume different answers. They hesitate before challenging someone who appears controlled, polished, and successful by every visible metric. Doubt feels inappropriate. Skepticism feels rude. The documentary doesn't argue that image is fake. It argues that image is powerful, powerful enough to redirect attention, powerful enough to decide which stories are told and which ones are quietly set aside as unnecessary. Old clips resurface, acceptance speeches, business announcements, carefully chosen words delivered at the right moments. None of them troubling on their own. But together, they show how consistency creates credibility, and credibility creates protection. What makes this section compelling is how familiar it feels. Viewers recognize this pattern far beyond music. In politics, in business, in media. The better someone performs stability, the less people question the foundation beneath it. The documentary suggests that once someone reaches this level, criticism has to pass through layers before it ever reaches them. Lawyers, advisors, publicists, each one smoothing edges, refining language, ensuring nothing lands too sharply. Meanwhile, those without that infrastructure don't get the same grace. Their mistakes define them. Their questions get labeled disruptive. Their voices sound inconvenient instead of insightful. This contrast hangs in the air as the film moves forward. It's no longer about who is right or wrong. It's about who is believed. And belief, once established, is incredibly difficult to reverse. By the time this chapter closes, the audience understands something crucial. Power doesn't always silence critics by force. Sometimes it simply outgrows them. And once that happens, accountability has to work twice as hard just to be heard. That realization lingers because it reframes everything that came before and everything that's about to follow. As the documentary moves forward, something subtle begins to happen. The past starts feeling heavier, not because new information is introduced, but because old moments are suddenly impossible to watch the same way again. Clips that once felt casual now feel unfinished. Jokes land differently. Pauses stretch longer than they used to. Interviews that once sounded confident now sound careful. The audience realizes they're not learning something new. They're relearning something old with a sharper lens. The film revisits moments that lived comfortably in pop culture for years. Red carpet laughter, award show banter, offhand remarks that were brushed off as personality. At the time, nothing felt alarming. But now, placed alongside everything else, those same moments feel loaded with subtext. It's not about guilt, it's about awareness. The documentary lets these moments breathe, resisting the urge to explain them, because explanation would weaken the effect. The power is in recognition, in realizing how easily context can be ignored when success is loud enough. Viewers begin to notice how often questions were redirected instead of answered, how interviews pivoted just before discomfort settled in, how narratives were reframed toward achievement whenever scrutiny appeared. None of this was hidden. It was normalized. And that's the unsettling part. According to the perspective shaping this story, history doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for the moment when attention slows down enough to catch what it missed the first time. And once that moment arrives, the past doesn't accuse, it reminds. This is where the documentary's tone deepens. The energy isn't confrontational anymore. It's reflective, almost mournful, as if acknowledging how many opportunities there were to ask harder questions, and how often they were passed over in favor of celebration. The audience starts to feel complicit, not guilty, but involved. Because these moments weren't hidden from view. They were broadcast, shared, applauded, and forgotten. The film suggests that power doesn't rely on secrecy alone. It relies on repetition, on familiarity dulling curiosity, on the audience trusting that if something were wrong, someone else would have spoken up already. But what if no one did? As this idea settles, the documentary begins to feel less like a story and more like a mirror. One reflecting not just the industry, but the culture that consumed it without questioning the cost. By now, viewers aren't waiting for a reveal. They're waiting for understanding, for clarity about how so much could exist in plain sight without ever being fully seen. And that's when it becomes clear. The most uncomfortable truths aren't hidden in darkness. They're hidden in familiarity. By this point, the story no longer feels contained within the documentary itself. It feels like it has slipped into the real world, where reactions don't arrive as applause or outrage, but as calculation. The tone outside the screen shifts. Conversations grow careful. Words are weighed. Responses slow down. What's striking is how little needs to be said for everyone to understand what's happening. The documentary doesn't show panic. It shows adjustment. Public language becomes precise. Statements feel drafted by committees. Silence becomes intentional rather than accidental. And that kind of silence carries meaning. It suggests that the narrative has reached a place where improvisation is risky. Attention turns to process, not spectacle, but procedure. How institutions react when questions gain traction. How systems begin reviewing themselves quietly, away from cameras and comment sections. This isn't about reacting to public noise. It's about assessing exposure. The film implies that when enough dots align, momentum doesn't need encouragement. It builds on its own. Old material gets re-examined. Past decisions are revisited with new caution. Not because someone demanded it, but because ignoring it now carries consequences. This is the phase most people never witness, where nothing dramatic happens on screen, but everything shifts behind it. Meetings occur that were never scheduled before. Files are reopened without announcement. Conversations change tone without explanation. What makes this moment powerful is its restraint. No dramatic score, no declarations, just the understanding that the story has crossed a threshold. It's no longer about opinion. It's about responsibility. The documentary doesn't celebrate this. It treats it as inevitable. When narratives become too consistent to dismiss, systems respond, not to protect reputations, but to protect themselves. And self-preservation is one of the most reliable forces in any industry. Viewers sense the gravity tightening, not because of what's revealed, but because of how carefully everything is now handled. When power becomes cautious, it's rarely because it feels confident. It's because uncertainty has entered the room. The story reaches a quiet intensity here, the kind that doesn't rely on shock, but on realization. That what began as a documentary has become a reference point, something people will return to, quote, indirectly, and consider before making decisions. There's no resolution offered, no outcome promised, just the understanding that movement has begun, and movement, once started, doesn't require permission to continue. As the screen holds on this moment, the audience feels it clearly. This is no longer about what might happen. It's about what has already started to change. As the story nears its end, the weight of everything that's been shown begins to settle in a different way. Not as shock, not as outrage, but as recognition. The kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. The documentary doesn't rush toward conclusions. It resists the urge to tell viewers what to believe. Instead, it circles back to something simpler and more unsettling. Memory. How easily it can be shaped. How often it's guided by success, charisma, and repetition rather than clarity. By now, the audience understands that this was never about exposing a single moment. It was about tracing a pattern across years, about showing how power learns to protect itself without ever announcing that it's doing so, about how silence, image, and proximity work together to create stability that feels natural, even when it isn't. The film lingers on the idea that culture doesn't just reflect power. It reinforces it. What gets celebrated gets repeated. What gets ignored fades. And over time, that process feels less like choice and more like destiny. What makes this realization uncomfortable is how little resistance it meets. Viewers recognize the cycle because they've lived inside it. They've consumed it, shared it, defended it. Not out of malice, but out of habit. The documentary doesn't ask for apologies. It asks for awareness. It suggests that accountability doesn't always arrive through dramatic moments. Sometimes it begins with rewatching, with rethinking, with noticing what once felt invisible. As the final stretch unfolds, the tone becomes quieter still. almost reflective, as if acknowledging that the hardest part of any reckoning isn't confrontation, it's acceptance. Accepting that systems don't change quickly, that narratives don't unravel all at once, that truth often arrives in fragments, not declarations. There's no promise of resolution here, no guarantee that questions will be answered publicly or neatly. The film seems to understand that real change rarely announces itself. It moves gradually, through pressure rather than force. What remains with the viewer is not certainty, but curiosity, a heightened sensitivity to patterns, a reluctance to accept easy explanations, a sense that some stories deserve patience, not dismissal. And in that way, the documentary accomplishes something far more lasting than exposure. It shifts how people watch, how they listen, how they interpret power when it presents itself as stability. Because once your perspective changes, it doesn't reset. It carries forward into every interview, every headline, every carefully worded silence that follows. And that may be the most permanent impact of all. By the time the story reaches its final moments, there's no tension left to manufacture. It doesn't need it. The weight is already there, sitting quietly, asking to be acknowledged. What began as a documentary has turned into a lens, one that changes how everything before it is understood, and how everything after it will be judged. Not because it delivered answers, but because it disrupted comfort. It made certainty feel premature. It made silence feel intentional. The film doesn't position itself as the end of a conversation. It positions itself as the moment the conversation could no longer be avoided. And that distinction matters. Endings suggest closure. This feels more like awareness. There's a realization that settles in slowly. Systems don't collapse when questioned. They adapt. They absorb pressure. They adjust language. And they wait. Which is why the most meaningful change doesn't always look dramatic. It looks gradual, careful, almost invisible. The audience is left understanding that accountability doesn't always arrive with headlines or verdicts. Sometimes it arrives as discomfort, as hesitation before speaking, as a pause where there used to be confidence, as a need to choose words more carefully than before. What lingers most is not suspicion, but responsibility. The responsibility of paying attention, of not confusing polish for truth, of recognizing that power, when left uninterrogated, becomes indistinguishable from normalcy. The documentary never claims to define reality. It challenges viewers to reconsider how reality is presented. Who benefits from certain narratives? Who disappears when others rise? And how easily repetition can replace reflection. In its final seconds, the story doesn't point outward. It turns inward, toward the audience, toward the culture that consumed success without questioning its structure, toward the habit of waiting for someone else to speak first. There's no call to outrage, no demand for allegiance, just an invitation to stay curious, to stay aware. To understand that once perspective shifts, it doesn't return to its original shape. Because the most powerful stories don't tell you what to think. They change how you think. And once that happens, the reckoning doesn't end. It continues.